Hey guys, tonight we're going to solve a mystery you see in the mirror every single day. A feature that connects you to every human who has ever lived and separates you from every other animal on Earth. Imagine, we are standing on the vast Serengeti plain 3 million years ago. The sun is hot, the grass is tall, and the world is ruled by predators with teeth like daggers. But in the distance, a small family group moves through the grass. They are our ancestors, Australopithecus afarensis, and as you look at their faces, you see something familiar, yet profoundly different. They have eyes, a nose, a mouth, but something is missing. Over the next 3 million years, their descendants will learn to tame fire, to craft stone into tools, to hunt mammoths on frozen tundras. Their brains will triple in size, their minds will give birth to art, language, and civilization. But somewhere along that epic journey, a tiny, seemingly insignificant feature appeared on their faces. A small ledge of bone. Why did it emerge? What purpose could it possibly serve that was so important it became a permanent fixture on every human face that followed? Tonight, thanks to clues locked away in ancient fossils and the latest biomechanical science, we are going to trace the story of that bone and try to answer why we, and we alone, have chins. Frankly, if you look at the fossil record, most of our ancestors were so brutally chinless, they'd make a modern-day movie villain look like they had a jawline carved from granite. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. That small click sends a big signal to the algorithm that long-form, serious educational content still matters. And to me, it's an incredibly meaningful show of support. Thank you so much for helping keep this channel going strong. It always fascinates me to see where you're all tuning in from. Let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're lying there now, and you can probably feel it. This little shelf on your face that we call a chin. It's a trait you share with every single human who has ever lived. Every king, every farmer, every artist, every person you've ever known, and all the billions before them. But here's the strange part. No other animal on Earth has it. It's not your big brain or your opposable thumbs. It's that little bony ledge. To understand how truly weird this is, you have to travel back to the 1700s. A Swedish botanist named Carl Linnaeus is busy creating his grand system of nature, meticulously cataloguing and describing every species he can. For a grizzly bear, he lists its traits. For a bald eagle, the same. But when he gets to our own species, Homo sapiens, he does something strange. Next to the name, he doesn't include a description of any distinct traits like he did for other species. No mention of our brains or our hands. He simply writes a 2-word Latin phrase, noscete ipsum, know thyself. As it turns out, that's a lot harder than you might think. Ever since Linnaeus left that blank space, scientists have been trying to fill it in, to find that one thing that is uniquely ours. For a long time, we thought we had it. We were man the tool maker, the only creature smart enough to fashion tools. Then, in the 1960s, a young Jane Goodall watched chimpanzees in the wild stripping leaves from twigs to fish for termites, shattering that idea. We were man the hunter, the great cooperative predator. But then you watch a pod of orcas or a pack of wolves work together with stunning precision, and that idea feels a bit less special. And of course, there's the big one, our massive brains. Surely that's it. But even that is complicated. Historians still argue over the precise timeline of encephalization, but we know that our extinct cousins, the Neanderthals, actually had slightly larger brains on average than we do. For centuries, we have been slowly debunking our own claims to uniqueness. But through all of this, one small, bony feature has held up to scrutiny: the chin. It's the last anatomical trait left on the list that seems to be exclusively ours, which leads to a deceptively simple question. Something so unique to us, something that has been on every human face since the dawn of our species, must have a purpose, right? Well, maybe not. It could just be an evolutionary accident, a leftover piece from some other project, never directly shaped by natural selection. But you have to wonder, why is it there? And how, in a world full of jaws, did we end up as the only ones with a chin? It's a bit strange that you even need to give a technical definition for something as obvious as a chin. You know one when you see one, and you've been seeing one in the mirror your entire life. But in the world of paleoanthropology, where you might only have a fragment of a jawbone to identify an entire species, precision is everything. We're not just talking about a random bony bump. This is a specific piece of facial architecture, as deliberately constructed as the arch of a cathedral. Scientists have a formal name for it: the mental eminence, or the mental protuberance. Now, the word mental here has nothing to do with your mind. It comes from the Latin word mentum, which simply means chin. It's a bit of linguistic trivia that reminds you how ancient the study of anatomy really is. To truly understand your chin, you have to see it not just as a single feature, but as a configuration, a shape that anthropologists call the inverted T. Go ahead, you can feel it on your own face right now. Place your finger in the very center of your chin. That subtle vertical ridge that runs down the middle of the jaw is the first part of the structure. It's a remnant of the mental symphysis, the seam where the two halves of your lower jaw fused together from two separate pieces of bone when you were just an infant. Now, trace that line down until you feel the hard, horizontal shelf of bone at the bottom edge of your jaw. That's the base of the T. It's the part that actually juts out into the world. To complete the shape, notice the two slight depressions on either side of that central ridge, just above the horizontal bar. These are the mental fossae. That whole complex, the vertical ridge, the horizontal bar, and the two flanking hollows, is the anatomical signature of a true human chin. What's truly profound is that this isn't a feature that suddenly appears during a teenage growth spurt. It's a fundamental part of the human blueprint. Scientific evidence from detailed studies of embryonic and fetal development shows that this specific anatomical configuration is present from the time we're fetuses. While the jaw of a tiny human fetus is still developing, it's already following a unique growth pattern, a set of genetic instructions that are different from any other creatures. Developmental biologists still debate the precise genetic cascades that signal the lower part of the human jaw to grow forward, creating this unique projection. It's a deeply embedded instruction, a core chapter in the story of how to build a human. To fully appreciate just how strange this forward-jutting ledge is, you have to understand what everyone else has instead. If you were to look at the jaw of almost any other mammal, from a mouse to a lion to a chimpanzee, you'd see the opposite. Their jawline doesn't project forward. It slopes backwards from the base of the teeth in what's called a receding symphysis. Imagine the jaw in profile. A human jaw drops down from the teeth and then angles forward to a point. It's an aggressive, forward-moving piece of geometry. A chimp's jaw, by contrast, simply falls away. It slopes back and under, creating a smooth, receding line. There's no ledge, no shelf, no T-shaped buttress. There's just less. This isn't a minor variation. It's a completely different design philosophy. And as we began to uncover the fossils of our own extinct relatives, this stark difference would become the central clue in a mystery that we're still trying to solve today. The presence of that little bony ledge, or the glaring lack of it, would become the dividing line between us and all of them. Now, to really grasp the loneliness of your chin, you have to take a little tour through the hall of faces that came before us. Imagine you're in a museum archive, a place of quiet shelves and the faint, dry smell of old bone. Someone places 2 skulls on the table in front of you. One is human. You recognize it instantly. The other belongs to our closest living relative, a chimpanzee. At first, you see the similarities, the eye sockets, the nasal cavity. But then your gaze drops to the jawline. The human skull has that familiar, forward-jutting mental eminence. It's a statement. The chimpanzee skull, in stark contrast, just stops. Its jaw slopes backward, tucking underneath the teeth in that receding symphysis we talked about. It's not just a subtle difference you need an expert to point out. It's a profound architectural void. One skull has a foundation, a prow. The other simply curves away. Now, let's swap the chimpanzee skull for one that hits a little closer to home. This one belongs to a Neanderthal. They were discovered in the 19th century, and for a long time, we pictured them as brutish, hunched-over cavemen. But we now know they were incredibly sophisticated. They buried their dead, likely had some form of language, and possessed brains that were, on average, even larger than our own. They were our contemporaries, another form of human sharing the planet with our ancestors. Yet, as you look at this Neanderthal skull, you see the same feature as the chimpanzee. No chin, a receding jawline. They were so much like us, our nearest extinct relative, but they lacked this one tiny piece of facial architecture. It's a crucial piece of the puzzle. Paleoanthropologists still debate the exact nature of the Neanderthal sapiens split, but the chin serves as a clear, physical dividing line between our 2 lineages. It's like finding 2 nearly identical car models, but one has a spoiler and the other doesn't. You know, somewhere in their design history, they took a different path. The pattern becomes even clearer as you journey deeper into the past. Let's travel back 3.5 million years and meet one of the most famous fossils ever found. Lucy, a member of the species Australopithecus afarensis. Her face was a mosaic of ape and human features, but her jaw tells an unambiguous story. There is no hint of a projection. Her lower face is all slope and retreat, a classic receding symphysis built for the powerful work of grinding tough, fibrous plants. For millions of years, this was the standard hominin design. It was a face built for function, without the strange little ornament that we carry today. And this wasn't just a feature of our most ancient, ape-like ancestors. Let's move forward to a more recent relative, the globe-trotting Homo erectus. These were true pioneers. They were the first of our ancestors to walk fully upright with a modern human gait, the first to control fire, and the first to leave Africa and spread across Asia. They were intelligent, adaptable, and incredibly successful, surviving for nearly 2 million years. Far longer than we Homo sapiens have existed so far. A truly quirky tidbit from history is that one of the most famous Homo erectus specimens, Peking man, was discovered in China in the 1920s and the original fossils mysteriously vanished during World War II, leaving us with only the excellent plaster casts made before the war. And when you look at those casts, at the jaw of this accomplished worldly ancestor, you find the same thing. No chin. Despite all their advancements, their faces still followed that ancient chinless blueprint. The evidence from the fossil record was becoming undeniable. The chin wasn't something we gradually developed over millions of years. It was a recent, sudden, and exclusive innovation, a signature that belonged only to us. The fossil record had drawn a clear line in the sand. On one side, millions of years of chinless ancestors. On the other, us. For a long time, it seemed the chin might have been a relatively recent addition, perhaps evolving well after our species had already established itself. But a discovery made in the heat and dust of East Africa would shatter that idea and push the origin of our most distinctive feature deep into the past. Let's travel now to the Homo River Valley in southern Ethiopia. The year is 1967. You're part of a team led by a young, ambitious paleoanthropologist named Richard Leakey, a man destined to become a legend in a field already dominated by his famous parents, Louis and Mary Leakey. It's a harsh, unforgiving landscape, a place of blistering sun and ancient river sediments that hold the secrets of human origins. The work is slow, painstaking. You spend your days walking, eyes fixed on the ground, scanning for the telltale shape and texture of fossilized bone among the millions of ordinary rocks. Most days, you find nothing. But then, a member of the team spots something promising eroding out of a hillside. It's not a complete skeleton, not the kind of discovery that makes for dramatic headlines. What you find are fragments. A piece of a cranium here, a few vertebrae there, some limb bones. The fossils are given the designation Homo 1. In the world of fossil hunting, you learn to celebrate these small, broken victories, because a single piece of bone can rewrite the entire story of human evolution. And among the scattered remains of Homo 1, there is one piece that is more important than all the others for our story: the mandible, the lower jaw. As the dust is carefully brushed away, you see it. The bone is ancient, mineralized, and stained by the earth it has rested in for an unimaginable length of time. But the shape is unmistakable. It's not sloped. It's not receding. It has a clear, prominent, and thoroughly modern-looking chin. It looks like a jaw you could see on any person walking down the street today. The initial scientific evidence, based on the dating methods of the time, suggested the fossils were around 130,000 years old, impressively ancient, but still within a relatively recent chapter of our history. Here's a quirky tidbit about paleontology, though. The story of a fossil is never truly finished. Decades later, with more advanced technology, scientists revisited Homo 1. Using a sophisticated technique called argon-argon dating on the layers of volcanic ash above and below the fossil, they were able to get a much more precise age. The results were stunning. Homo 1 wasn't 130,000 years old. It was closer to 230,000 years old. This discovery was monumental. It confirmed that the human chin isn't a late-in-the-game evolutionary tweak. It's not a feature our species added after the fact. It has been a stable, defining characteristic of Homo sapiens since our very earliest days. Finding a chin on a fossil this old is like finding a smartphone in a photograph from the 1920s. It's so surprisingly modern that it forces you to rethink the entire timeline. While scholars still debate the precise location of our species' cradle, with compelling evidence from places like Jebel Irhoud in Morocco suggesting Homo sapiens may have emerged as early as 300,000 years ago, The Homo 1 fossil provides a firm anchor point. It tells us that for at least 250,000 years, our ancestors have looked back at their reflections with this same strange, bony ledge on their faces. It was part of the original package. It was there from the beginning. And that makes its purpose, or lack thereof, an even more profound and urgent question. To find the ultimate origin of your chin, you have to do something that seems completely counterintuitive. You have to forget about the head entirely. The story doesn't start with a mouth, or a jaw, or a brain. It starts with your feet. We have to rewind the clock, not just 250,000 years to Homo 1, but all the way back, 6 or 7 million years, to a vast forested landscape in Africa. Here, a group of apes is about to make a monumental choice. In a world of knuckles and claws, they are going to stand up. This singular act, the shift to bipedalism, is the foundational event of human history. It's the first domino to fall in a chain reaction so complex that it would ultimately, millions of years later, build a tiny shelf of bone on your face. This wasn't a simple or easy transition. A skeleton built for climbing in trees and walking on all fours is a masterpiece of engineering for that specific lifestyle. To retool it for walking upright is a complete overhaul. Imagine the blueprint. The spine, once a stiff, arched bridge supporting the torso from above, had to be remolded into a springy S-shaped column to absorb the shock of each footfall. The pelvis, once long and narrow, had to become short, broad, and bowl-shaped, creating a sturdy basin to hold the weight of your internal organs, which were now pressing straight down. Your thigh bones, the femurs, had to angle inward from the hips so that your knees and feet would be directly under your body's center of gravity, preventing you from waddling like a duck. These are not minor tweaks. This is a radical reinvention of the hominin chassis. The most elegant piece of scientific evidence for this shift is found in a place you might not think to look: a small hole at the base of the skull. It's called the foramen magnum, which is just Latin for great hole, and it's where the spinal cord enters the cranium to connect to the brain. In a chimpanzee or any other four-legged animal, this hole is positioned towards the back of the skull. This makes perfect sense. Their spine approaches their head from behind, but it means they need massive neck muscles to hold their head up and look forward. Now, look at a human skull. The foramen magnum isn't at the back. It's positioned almost directly underneath, right at the skull's balancing point. This allows your head to rest gracefully on top of your spine, held in place with much less muscular effort. This repositioning is the smoking gun of bipedalism in the fossil record. But this brilliant solution, balancing the head on the spine, created an entirely new set of architectural problems. The head was no longer thrown forward from the body. It was now a top-floor penthouse, and its new position would constrain how every other part of it could evolve. The stage was set for a complete cranial reshuffle. And of course, this begs the question, why did they stand up in the first place? It's a huge gamble. You become slower, less stable, and you expose your soft underbelly to predators. Paleoanthropologists still argue fiercely about the primary driver for this shift. The classic and somewhat romantic idea is the savanna hypothesis. As forests shrank and grasslands spread, our ancestors stood up to see over the tall grass, to spot predators or locate resources. Another idea is that it freed the hands, allowing them to carry food back to a home base, or to eventually carry tools and infants. A more quirky and surprisingly compelling theory, focuses on thermoregulation. Standing upright exposes far less of your body to the direct overhead sun and lifts you into breezier air currents, helping you stay cool. Whatever the reason, this new posture was the beginning of our story. It was the decision that would force our skeleton, and eventually our skull, down a completely new and uncharted evolutionary path. For millions of years, your ancestors walked the earth with ape-sized brains in their newly upright bodies. Standing up was revolutionary, but it was just the prologue. The next chapter in the great cranial reshuffle begins around 2.5 million years ago, with a new character entering the stage, Homo habilis, or handy man. You're back in the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, and the world is getting drier. The forests are retreating, replaced by vast open savanna. It's here that you find the first definitive members of our own genus, Homo. And when you look at their skulls, you see the next great leap forward. Their brains have started to grow. This is the beginning of encephalization, the brain explosion that would define our lineage. This wasn't a trivial change. A bigger brain is an incredibly expensive piece of biological equipment. Your brain, right now, as you lie there listening, makes up only about 2% of your body weight, yet it devours a staggering 20% of your daily caloric intake. An infant's brain can consume up to 60% of everything they eat. It's a greedy, power-hungry organ. So, for a species to evolve a bigger brain, it has to solve a fundamental energy crisis. You can't just slap a bigger engine into a car without upgrading the fuel tank and the intake. This biological riddle is the basis for a famous scientific concept called the expensive tissue hypothesis. The idea is that in any animal's body, there's a finite energy budget. To afford a more expensive brain, our ancestors had to make cuts elsewhere. The hypothesis suggests we did it by shrinking another incredibly expensive organ, our gut. A long, complex digestive tract, like that of a gorilla, is necessary to ferment and extract nutrients from tough, fibrous plants. It's also incredibly energy-intensive. By switching to higher quality, easier to digest foods, specifically meat and bone marrow, we could get away with a much shorter, simpler gut. This dietary revolution freed up the metabolic energy needed to fuel a growing brain. Of course, a bigger brain needs a bigger house. You can see the architectural consequences written directly on the bones of Homo habilis. Their brain case, the cranium, begins to expand. It swells upwards and outwards, becoming taller and more rounded, more dome-like than the flattened, football-shaped skulls of their Australopithecus ancestors. This is a critical step in reshaping the entire head. As the brain case inflates, it starts to change its relationship with the face. You're witnessing the start of a multi-million-year-long process where the face will eventually be tucked neatly underneath the ballooning frontal lobe of the brain. Anthropologists still debate which came first in this revolutionary cycle. Was it a lucky mutation leading to a slightly bigger brain that allowed for the cleverness to acquire better food? Or was it a behavioral shift, scavenging meat from predator kills, that provided the energy surplus needed for the brain to start growing in the first place? It's the ultimate evolutionary chicken and egg problem. What is clear is that this kicked off one of the most powerful positive feedback loops in the history of life. A slightly bigger brain allows you to make a slightly better stone tool. That better tool allows you to butcher a carcass more efficiently or smash open a bone to get at the calorie-rich marrow inside. That high-quality food provides the fuel for even more brain growth in the next generation. That even bigger brain then allows you to create an even more sophisticated tool, cooperate more effectively in a group, and outsmart your competitors. Better tools lead to better food, which leads to bigger brains, which leads to even better tools. You are no longer just a clever ape. You are a creature caught in an evolutionary updraft, and it's carrying you and your skull into a completely new and uncharted form. That positive feedback loop, bigger brains, better food, was the engine of our evolution. But it came with a serious design challenge. You can't just keep inflating a brain case indefinitely without it having a dramatic effect on everything around it. And the thing directly in front of the expanding brain was the face. To see what happened next, you need to imagine two skulls on that same museum table. The first one belongs to an early ancestor, like Australopithecus. You notice right away that its face is big and juts forward, a prominent snout that projects well ahead of its small brain case. This is a condition scientists call prognathism. Now, next to it, place a modern human skull. The difference is shocking. Your face isn't a snout. It's flat, vertical, and tucked almost neatly underneath the massive dome of your forehead. This is called an orthognathic face. The entire story of human evolution, from 3 million years ago to today, is the story of that slow, dramatic retreat from a projecting face to a flat one. So why did this happen? It wasn't a choice. It was a matter of physics and architecture. Imagine the skull is a construction project. The brain case is a balloon, and the face is a box attached to its front. In our early ancestors, the balloon was small and the box was big. But as the feedback loop took off, the balloon of the brain case started to inflate, expanding up, out, and, crucially, forward. This expanding frontal lobe, the very part of the brain responsible for our higher reasoning, began to press down on the facial structure. The face was quite literally forced to rotate and tuck itself underneath the burgeoning brain. It's like a quirk of cosmic engineering. In order for us to get smarter, our faces had to get out of the way. This great facial tuck-in was only possible because of another major trend: the shrinking of our jaws and teeth. Remember, thanks to the invention of cooking and stone tools, our food became much easier to process. You no longer needed a massive dental toolkit for hours of grinding tough plants or ripping raw meat. As a result, our teeth began to shrink over millions of years, a process called dental reduction. Our molars, once huge grinding platforms, became smaller. Our canines, which in many primates are large, dagger-like teeth used for display and fighting, became tiny and incisor-like. And if you have smaller teeth, you don't need a huge, robust jaw to hold them. The entire dental arcade could shrink. The exact interplay of these forces, the push from the expanding brain versus the pull from a shrinking dental system, is still a hot topic of debate among paleoanthropologists, but the end result is the same. The face got smaller, and the brain got bigger. This whole multi-million-year process, this epic cranial reshuffling, culminates in the face you have today, uniquely small, delicate, and flat. You could think of it as the most significant remodeling project in natural history. The old design had the engine, the jaw and teeth, at the front, and the driver's cabin, the brain, in the back. The new design moved the driver's cabin to a massive top-floor suite with a panoramic view and tucked the now much smaller engine underneath it. This final arrangement, this flat-faced Homo sapiens skull, is the anatomical stage upon which our final mystery will play out. Because it is on this newly arranged face, this product of bipedalism, brain growth, and dietary revolution, that the chin finally and inexplicably appears. The scene is set, the characters are in place, And now we can finally start asking, what is it for? The story of your shrinking face needed a catalyst, a force powerful enough to relax the evolutionary demands that had kept hominin jaws big and brawny for millions of years. That force, according to one revolutionary idea, wasn't a change in climate or a new predator. It was the simple, transformative power of a cooking fire. Let's introduce the work of a British primatologist named Richard Wrangham. For years he studied chimpanzees in the wild, observing their grueling daily routine. He saw them spend 4 to 6 hours a day just chewing tough, uncooked fruits and leaves. It was a full-time job. This observation sparked a powerful thought. If our closest relatives have to work that hard to eat, how did our ancestors, with their much bigger brains to feed, ever find the time? His answer, which he developed into the cooking hypothesis, is as elegant as it is profound. We didn't evolve bigger brains and then discover cooking. We discovered cooking, and that is what allowed us to evolve bigger brains and smaller faces. At its heart, Wrangham's idea reframes cooking not as a culinary art, but as a biological pre-treatment. You can think of a campfire as an external stomach. When you cook food, you are beginning the process of digestion before it even enters your body. The heat breaks down tough plant cellulose and the rigid collagen in meat, things your stomach struggles with. It denatures proteins, essentially unraveling them from their complex, folded shapes into simpler chains that your enzymes can attack much more easily. A baked potato is infinitely more digestible and yields far more calories than a raw one. A cooked piece of meat requires drastically less effort to chew and digest than a raw steak. This simple act outsources the hardest work of digestion from your body to the fire, unlocking a massive surplus of time and energy. Now, pinning down the exact moment our ancestors tamed fire is one of the greatest challenges in archaeology. A campfire from 1 million years ago doesn't leave much behind. It's incredibly difficult for scientists to distinguish the ash and burnt bone from a controlled, man-made hearth, from the remnants of a natural wildfire that just happened to sweep through a cave. However, the scientific evidence is mounting. At sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, archaeologists have found evidence of repeated, controlled fires deep within the cave, dating back at least 1 million years, squarely in the time of Homo erectus. And when you look at the anatomy of Homo erectus, the hypothesis fits beautifully. They had smaller teeth and a smaller gut compared to their ancestors, and a brain that was starting to take off. Wrangham argues this isn't a coincidence. It's the anatomical signature of a species that had begun to cook its food. The evolutionary consequence of this is monumental. If the fire is doing most of the mechanical work of breaking down your food, you simply don't need the same heavy-duty equipment anymore. The immense selective pressure to maintain massive, powerful jaws and teeth with enamel as thick as floor tiles is suddenly lifted. For millions of years, having a huge jaw was a matter of life and death. If you couldn't process enough food, you didn't survive. But for a creature that cooks, it's no longer a critical feature. The jaw was free to shrink. Historians still argue about whether this was a slow, gradual adoption or a rapid revolution, but the effect was the same. Cooking didn't just warm our ancestors' nights, it fundamentally reshaped their bodies. It relaxed the muscular and skeletal requirements of the face, allowing for a more gracile, less robust jaw. This process, this masticatory gracilization, is the final and most crucial step that sets the stage for the appearance of the chin. It created the small, delicate canvas on which that final, strange feature could finally emerge. The cooking fire was a game changer, But it wasn't the only revolutionary technology our ancestors developed. Working in perfect tandem with the power of the flame was the power of a sharpened stone. Before you can cook meat, you have to acquire it and process it, and for millions of years, hominins were not exactly at the top of the food chain. Lacking the claws and fangs of a true carnivore, they had to rely on their wits, and their greatest invention was the ability to turn a simple river cobble into a razor-sharp blade. Let's move from the hearthside back out onto the savannah, about 2.6 million years ago. You're watching a group of Homo habilis at the site of a kill, maybe a large antelope brought down by a lion. After the primary predators have had their fill and moved on, your ancestors move in. This is where their toolkit, the so-called older one tool industry, becomes the key to survival. These weren't beautifully crafted spear points, they were brutally simple and effective. A hominin would take one stone, the hammerstone, and strike another, the core, to break off a sharp-edged flake. That little flake, held between thumb and forefinger, became a prehistoric scalpel. With it, they could do something no other scavenger could. They could slice through the thick hide of a large animal and get at the vast quantities of meat left on the carcass. But the real prize, the secret weapon in their dietary arsenal, was inside the bones. This is a truly quirky tidbit about the savanna ecosystem. Bone marrow is one of the most calorie-dense foods available, packed with fat and nutrients. It's also locked away inside a nearly impenetrable container. A hyena might be able to crush some smaller bones, but the thick, heavy leg bones of a buffalo or a wildebeest are beyond them. But your ancestors had a solution. Using the heavy, blunt core stone they had just created, they could systematically smash open these bones, accessing the rich, fatty marrow inside. You can think of this as a profound act of technological outsourcing. Our ancestors began using tools to do the jobs their teeth used to be responsible for. Instead of massive, powerful canine teeth to rip and tear, they had sharp stone flakes. Instead of huge, flattened molars designed for crushing and grinding, they had heavy hammer stones. The entire demanding, mechanically stressful process of breaking down a carcass was transferred from their biology to their technology. The scientific evidence for this is etched directly onto the fossil record. At ancient hominin sites, paleoanthropologists find vast collections of animal bones with telltale marks on them. Under a microscope, you can see the fine, V-shaped grooves left by stone tools slicing off meat, clearly distinct from the wider U-shaped gouges left by predator teeth. Sometimes you even find stone tool-cut marks overlying predator tooth marks, which has led to a long-standing scholarly debate. Were our early ancestors brave hunters or just incredibly clever scavengers, the smart vultures of the savannah, who let the big predators do the dangerous work and then swooped in to clean up the leftovers? Whatever their exact strategy was, the result was the same. Now, you have to combine the impact of these stone tools with the impact of the fire we just discussed. They are two sides of the same coin, a dual-force revolution in food processing. The tools get you access to the high-quality meat and marrow, and the fire makes it exponentially easier to digest and extract calories from. This 1-2 punch delivered a devastating blow to the old evolutionary regime that had favored huge, powerful jaws. The intense selective pressure was gone. The need for a massive facial structure built around a powerful chewing apparatus was rendered obsolete. This cumulative effect accelerated the evolutionary trend toward a smaller, more delicate, or gracile, jaw. This process, which scientists call masticatory gracilization, is the final piece of the puzzle. The stage has now been completely remodeled. The old, heavy-duty machinery of the prognathic face has been cleared away, leaving a smaller, flatter, more modern facial structure. And it's within this new, lighter architecture that the mystery of the chin can finally be addressed. So, the stage is now perfectly set. The old, heavy-duty architecture of the primate face has been dismantled over millions of years, replaced by the lighter, flatter, more modern facial structure of Homo sapiens. And on this new stage, the chin makes its debut. For the first time, scientists could stop asking how the face changed and start asking why this one peculiar feature appeared. And the first major attempt at an answer was as elegant as it was intuitive. You have to journey back to the year 1913. The world is on the brink of immense change, and the scientific community is still buzzing with the aftershocks of Darwin's theories. In a medical journal, a physician publishes an article with a simple, compelling title: The Story of the Chin. This wasn't just a casual observation. It was the first serious, reasoned hypothesis for the chin's existence, and it attempted to link our unique anatomy directly to our most cherished unique ability, our voice. The logic was incredibly seductive. Think for a moment about the act of speaking. It's a stunning feat of biological acrobatics. The sheer speed and precision required of your tongue to produce complex, articulate speech is breathtaking. It flits and darts around your mouth, touching your teeth, your palate, your gums, hundreds of times a minute, shaping the air into words. The physician reasoned that such a powerful and agile organ couldn't just be floating there untethered. He imagined that it must require a special anchor point, a structural brace to support its rapid-fire movements, especially during the production of the most complex human sounds. And as he looked at the human jaw, there it was, a unique bony projection, a buttress located right at the front. The chin, he proposed, was that brace. It was a specialized piece of scaffolding that evolved to support the tongue's athletic demands. He even focused on a specific muscle, the one that does most of the tongue's heavy lifting. It's called the genioglossus muscle, a large fan-shaped muscle that makes up the bulk of your tongue. Its name comes from the Greek geneion, meaning chin, and glossa, meaning tongue. Its primary job is to protrude the tongue, pulling it forward out of the mouth, and to move it from side to side. It's the muscle that lets you stick your tongue out, and it's absolutely critical for forming a vast range of vowel and consonant sounds. The 1913 hypothesis was that the projecting chin provided a reinforced anchor for this all-important muscle, allowing it to pull and move with greater force and stability, effectively fine-tuning the instrument of speech. For a while, this seemed like the perfect answer. It was a neat, tidy package that connected two things that are undeniably unique to humans. We are the only species with a true chin, and we are the only species with a true, complex syntactic language. The correlation seemed too perfect to be a coincidence. It felt like an evolutionary two-for-one deal. Here was a physical marker, a piece of bone in the fossil record, that might even signal when our ancestors crossed the threshold into becoming true speaking beings. The exact origin of language itself, of course, remains one of the most fiercely debated topics in all of science, with linguists and anthropologists arguing whether it was a sudden invention or a slow, gradual accumulation of complexity. The speech hypothesis for the chin offered a tantalizing piece of physical evidence in that great debate. It was a beautiful idea, connecting our anatomy directly to our humanity. It made perfect logical sense. The only problem, as we would soon discover, is that it was completely wrong. The speech hypothesis was beautiful, it was clean, it was poetic, and it linked our most unique anatomical feature to our most profound cognitive skill. For a moment in scientific history, it felt like the mystery had been solved. But science is a ruthless business. An elegant idea, no matter how much you love it, has to survive a brutal encounter with the evidence. And when researchers took a closer look at the actual physical anatomy of the human jaw, the entire beautiful story began to unravel. It's the classic tragedy of science, a wonderful hypothesis being mugged in a dark alley by a gang of inconvenient facts. The critical flaw, the single point on which the whole theory collapsed, was a simple matter of location, location, location. The hypothesis claimed the chin evolved as a reinforced anchor for the genioglossus muscle, the engine of the tongue. But when you actually look at a human mandible, you discover that the muscle doesn't attach there. It's not even close. The projecting, bony part of your chin, the mental eminence that you can feel with your finger, has almost no major muscle attachments at all. It's just bone. The powerful genioglossus muscle, the one supposedly needing all that support, instead reaches inside the jaw, bypassing the chin completely. Its true anchor points are two tiny, almost insignificant bumps of bone on the inner surface of your jawbone, just behind where the two halves meet. They're called the genial tubercles or mental spines, and you'd never know they were there. This is a quirky little tidbit of anatomy. Your skeleton is covered in these named yet minuscule lumps and bumps that serve as crucial attachment points for muscles and ligaments. The genial tubercles are the true workhorses here. They are the mooring posts to which the tongue's powerful ropes are tied. The chin, the supposed great anchor, is left out of the equation entirely. It's like building a massive, reinforced suspension bridge tower and then tying the bridge cables to a small post in the parking lot next to it. The anatomy simply didn't match the theory. So, if the chin isn't helping us speak, what is? Well, the real hero of human speech is a much stranger and far more obscure piece of our skeleton. It's called the hyoid bone. It's a small U-shaped bone that sits in your neck, right around the level of the base of your jaw. And here's what makes it one of the most unique bones in all of nature. It is the only bone in your body that does not directly connect to any other bone. It just floats. It's held in place by a complex web of muscles and ligaments, connecting it to the tongue above and the larynx, your voice box below. This floating anchor system is the secret to our vocal dexterity. It allows the tongue and larynx a phenomenal range of motion, letting us create the vast and nuanced array of sounds required for complex language. A chimpanzee's hyoid, by contrast, is positioned much higher in the neck, restricting the movement of their larynx and limiting the sounds they can produce. The verdict was clear and unavoidable. The speech hypothesis, for all its elegance, had to be discarded. It was a clever idea, but it simply crumbled under basic anatomical scrutiny. The chin wasn't in the right place to do the job. The real work was being done by a humble set of bumps on the inside of the jaw and a bizarre, floating bone in the neck. Scientists still debate the exact sequence of evolutionary changes in the vocal tract, particularly the descent of the larynx and the repositioning of the hyoid, that ultimately gave us the power of speech. But they all agree on one thing. The chin wasn't a part of that story. The search for a purpose had to start all over again, moving from the subtlety of the voice to something far more primal. With the elegant speech hypothesis lying in pieces on the laboratory floor, the search for the chin's purpose took a sharp turn away from the poetic and veered into the primal. If the chin wasn't for talking, maybe it was for fighting. This brings us to one of the most famous and most criticized ideas in the whole debate, the punching hypothesis. Now, before we go any further, you have to understand a concept from evolutionary biology known as a just-so story. It's a term for a hypothesis that sounds plausible and tells a good, logical-sounding narrative, but which crumbles the moment you apply any real scientific scrutiny. It's a story that's just a little too neat, a little too convenient. And for many scientists, the idea that your chin is a piece of facial armor is a prime example. The argument itself is brutally simple. For much of human history, one of the primary drivers of male reproductive success was competition with other males. Researchers have long debated the role of interpersonal violence in shaping male physiology, but the hypothesis suggests that fistfights were a common way of settling disputes and establishing dominance. In a brawl, the jaw is a prime target. A solid punch can break the bone, dislocate the joint, and end a fight instantly. Therefore, any feature that could reinforce the jaw and protect it from a blow would offer a significant advantage. That advantage would lead to more victories, more mating opportunities, and more offspring who inherited that same feature. The chin, the hypothesis argues, is that reinforcement, a bony bumper that evolved specifically to take a punch. This wasn't just idle speculation. To bolster their case, researchers got creative with their evidence. In one particularly memorable study, they used data from an entirely different field of science, sports medicine. They looked at experiments where Olympic boxers had been asked to punch a specialized dummy head, one wired with sensors to better understand the physics of head injuries and concussions. The researchers took this data on impact forces and argued that robust facial features, like like strategically placed bones and muscles around the jaw, could be an evolutionary adaptation to better withstand such impacts. The chin, in this view, was the biological equivalent of a boxer's padded glove, a small but crucial piece of defensive equipment forged in the crucible of prehistoric combat. It's a dramatic story. You can almost picture it. But like many just-so stories, it falls apart pretty quickly. For one thing, if your chin is supposed to be armor, it's spectacularly bad at its job. Ask any emergency room doctor where the human jaw is most likely to fracture in a fight, and they'll point to a few common spots. One of them is right on or next to the chin. Instead of being a sturdy reinforcement, it often acts as a crumple zone. Secondly, it offers very little protection to the parts that really matter. A punch hard enough to threaten the jawbone is still going to rattle your teeth and, more importantly, send a shockwave up to the delicate temporomandibular joint, the TMJ, where your jaw hinges to your skull. A dislocated jaw ends a fight just as effectively as a broken one. And finally, if evolution's goal was to build a punch-resistant jaw, there are far more effective ways to do it. You'd make the entire bone thicker, taller, and denser, more like the robust, chinless jaw of a Neanderthal. Simply sticking a small, bony triangle on the very front is an incredibly inefficient and frankly bizarre piece of engineering. The punching hypothesis makes for a great movie plot, but as a scientific explanation, it just doesn't land a solid blow. With the fighting hypothesis taking a technical knockout, the scientific search party turned to another one of Charles Darwin's big ideas. We always remember him for natural selection, the grim, relentless process of survival of the fittest. But Darwin proposed a second, equally powerful evolutionary engine: sexual selection. This is a different kind of evolution, one driven not by survival, but by desire. These are traits that evolve for one reason and one reason only: to increase an individual's chances of attracting a mate and having offspring. The classic example is the peacock's tail. That magnificent, iridescent train is a metabolic nightmare. It's heavy, it makes flying difficult, and it basically acts as a giant, shimmering eat-me sign for predators. From a natural selection standpoint, it's a disaster. But from a sexual selection standpoint, it's a roaring success because the peahens find it irresistible. This brings us to the sexual selection hypothesis for the chin. What if the chin has no practical function at all? What if it's not a brace for the tongue or armor for the jaw, but is simply an ornament? The idea is that at some point in our deep past, a prominent chin became an honest signal of an individual's quality. Perhaps it was an indicator of good health during development, or a sign of high testosterone levels and therefore genetic fitness. Whatever the reason, it became a feature that our ancestors found attractive. Individuals with more prominent chins were chosen as mates more often, had more children, and passed on the genes for that very same feature. Over thousands of generations, this preference would have sculpted the jawline of our entire species, turning a random feature into a universal sign of beauty or strength. There is a kernel of evidence that seems to support this idea. Sexual dimorphism. That's the scientific term for the physical differences between males and females of the same species beyond their reproductive organs. In humans, chins are a perfect example. On average, male chins tend to be taller and more square in shape, while female chins are typically smaller and more pointed. This difference is directly linked to the surge of hormones, particularly testosterone, that occurs during puberty, which influences the final stages of bone growth in the jaw. This is a scientific fact that you can observe across populations worldwide. The existence of this male-female difference in shape is exactly what you'd expect to see in a trait governed by sexual selection. However, the argument against this hypothesis is powerful, and it comes down to a single, overwhelming fact: universality. While the shape of the chin varies between the sexes, its fundamental structure, that projecting mental eminence, that inverted T, is present in everyone. All humans, male and female, have a chin. This is very different from classic sexually selected traits. The peacock has a train, but the peahen does not. A male lion has a mane, but the female does not. If the chin were purely an ornament for attracting mates, you would expect it to be far more pronounced in one sex, likely males if it's a signal of dominance, and greatly reduced or absent in the other. The fact that every single human is born with the basic architecture for a chin strongly suggests that its origin is not purely ornamental. Its roots likely lie in something more fundamental to the structure and development of the Homo sapiens skull, a deep architectural feature that is common to us all, rather than a flashy billboard for mate selection. The search for a purpose had to turn away from the bedroom and back to the engineering workshop. So, the chin isn't for speaking, fighting, or flirting. The most poetic and the most primal explanations have all been tried and found wanting. When you've exhausted all the glamorous possibilities, sometimes the only thing left to do is to look at the most basic, boring, and fundamental job a thing has. And for the jaw, that job is chewing. So, let's leave the boxing ring and the art gallery behind. You and I are going to step into the quiet, methodical world of a mechanical engineering workshop. We're going to stop thinking of the jaw as a piece of anatomy and start seeing it for what it truly is: a machine. A beautifully complex biological machine designed to perform one primary task: to apply force and withstand the resulting stress, day in and day out, for a lifetime. When you look at your jaw this way, it's basically a U-shaped lever, or more accurately, two levers joined at the front. Its job is to crush and grind food between your teeth. To do that, it has to endure a surprising variety of powerful forces. Let's break down the three main types of stress your jaw experiences every time you eat a meal. First, there's simple bending. Imagine you're chewing on something tough with your back molars, like a piece of jerky or a crunchy carrot. Your powerful chewing muscles, like the masseter on the side of your cheek, are contracting with immense force. This action turns your jaw into something like a shelf with a heavy weight placed on one end. The entire bone wants to bend downwards in the middle. The top edge, near your teeth, gets compressed, while the bottom edge gets stretched and pulled. Next, there's torsion, which is just a fancy word for twisting. When you chew vigorously on one side, the muscles on that side are firing on all cylinders, while the muscles on the other side are less active. This imbalance of forces can cause the entire jawbone to twist slightly along its length, like you're trying to wring out a wet towel. It's a subtle but significant stress that the bone has to be built to resist, preventing it from warping or cracking under the strain. But the most important stress for our story, the one that biomechanists became obsessed with, is a unique force called vertical bending. This happens at the very front of your jaw, at that seam where the two halves meet. The symphysis. When you bite down, your main chewing muscles pull the back ends of your jaw not just up, but also slightly inward. You can picture it like a wishbone. As you pull the two arms of the wishbone up and in, the bottom of the V-shape gets put under incredible strain. The same thing happens to your jaw. The top of the symphysis, near your front teeth, gets squeezed together, while the bottom edge gets pulled apart. This specific wishbone effect creates a point of high stress right at the base of your jaw, exactly where your chin is located. Now, why does any of this matter? Because of a fundamental principle of biology known as Wolff's Law. This is our key piece of scientific evidence. Proposed in the 19th century by a German surgeon named Julius Wolff, this law states that bone is not a static, lifeless scaffold. It is a living, dynamic tissue that actively remodels itself in response to the loads and stresses placed upon it. Bone will get thicker and stronger in areas of high stress, and it will weaken and atrophy in areas of low stress. This is why the serving arm of a professional tennis player has demonstrably denser bones than their other arm. A quirky tidbit is that this is also why astronauts are at risk of osteoporosis. In the weightlessness of space, their bones are freed from the constant stress of gravity, and Wolff's law kicks in reverse, causing them to lose bone mass. This law provides the crucial link. If the unique shape of the human jaw creates a unique pattern of stress, then Wolff's law predicts that the bone should have remodeled itself over evolutionary time to counteract that stress. This led biomechanists to a new and fiercely debated question. Could the chin simply be a direct, structural response to the wishbone-like forces of chewing on our uniquely shaped jaws? Maybe the chin isn't a feature that was added on for some special purpose. Maybe it's just bone, piled up in the precise location where it was needed most. A tiny buttress built by evolution to keep our jaw from pulling itself apart every time we sat down for dinner. So, your jaw is a machine, a lever built to withstand the punishing, repetitive stress of chewing. And thanks to Wolff's law, you know that this machine has the incredible ability to rebuild itself, adding material where stress is high and taking it away where it's low. This is the crucial context for the most durable, most debated, and most mechanically satisfying explanation for your chin: the chewing hypothesis. And it all begins with a simple, observable fact that sets our jaws apart from all others. When a scientist named Daniel Lieberman, now a famous professor at Harvard, began comparing the geometry of the human jaw to those of other primates, he found that ours are unique in how short and broad they are. Imagine the jaw of a chimpanzee, or one of our early ancestors. It's long and relatively narrow. Now picture a modern human jaw. It's much shorter from front to back and wider from side to side. It's less like a long, sleek canoe and more like a short, wide tugboat. This is where the engineering comes in. As any mechanical engineer will tell you, changing the shape of a structure, even slightly, can completely alter how it handles stress. Lieberman and other researchers argued that this specific, short, broad shape of the Homo sapiens jaw creates a unique set of mechanical problems that other primates simply don't have to deal with. In particular, it dramatically increases that wishbone effect we talked about, the vertical bending stress right at the symphysis where the two halves of your jaw meet. The powerful chewing muscles, not just the masseter on your cheek, but the temporalis on the side of your head and the pterygoid muscles deep inside, pull up and in on this short, wide frame, putting an immense strain on the front of the jaw, trying to pull the bottom edge apart. This was a new problem, a direct consequence of our evolutionary journey toward a smaller, flatter face. And here is where the chewing hypothesis offers its beautifully simple solution. What do you do when you have a wall that's buckling under a specific point of stress? You don't necessarily rebuild the whole wall thicker. You build a buttress, a small, targeted reinforcement of material placed at the exact point of maximum stress to counteract the force. Think of the flying buttresses on a Gothic cathedral. They are elegant, external supports that allow the towering walls to stand. The chewing hypothesis argues that your chin is precisely that, a biological buttress. It is a small, intelligently placed reinforcement of bone that evolved specifically to counteract the vertical bending stresses created by our uniquely shaped jaws. It's not for talking or fighting. It's a piece of structural engineering, a tiny strut that keeps your jaw from failing under the load of your own bite. For a while, this seemed to be the definitive answer, especially when researchers found what looked like a smoking gun. They examined the distribution of bone inside the jaw itself. Bone isn't uniform. It has a dense, hard outer layer called cortical bone and a lighter, spongy inner layer. Using sophisticated imaging, scientists found that the cortical bone is exceptionally thick, right where the vertical bending creates the most stress, down at the base of the symphysis, the very place where the two halves of the jaw wishbone come together. The structure of our bony chin seemed to exactly match the mechanical needs raised by our distinctive jaw shape. The evidence appeared to be a perfect match for the theory. The problem, a new type of stress, and the solution, a new piece of bone in the exact right spot, seemed to align with beautiful precision. For a moment, it seemed like the centuries-long mystery might finally be closed. The chin wasn't an accident or an ornament. It was a clever solution to an engineering problem that only our species had ever faced. The chewing hypothesis was, for a long time, the leading contender for the title. It had everything a good scientific theory needs: a clear problem, a plausible solution, and supporting anatomical evidence. But its strongest, most compelling argument was the sheer perfection of its timing. Think about the fossil record as a timeline. For millions of years, you see hominin after hominin, from Australopithecus to early Homo, with long ape-like jaw proportions, and not a single one has a chin. Then, suddenly, With the arrival of Homo sapiens and our uniquely short, broad jaws, the chin appears, seemingly right on cue. It was a perfect correlation. The problem, the new stress pattern, and the solution, the chin, appeared at the exact same moment in evolutionary history. This suggested that the chin truly was an adaptive response, a feature forged by natural selection to solve a new mechanical demand on the jaw. The story was neat, it was tidy, and for many scientists, it felt like the case was closed. But science never truly rests. As technology advanced, researchers developed new and incredibly powerful ways to test these old ideas. The decisive challenge to the chewing hypothesis came not from a new fossil discovery, but from the world of computer engineering. Scientists began using a sophisticated technique called finite element analysis, or FEA. It's a type of computer modeling that engineers use to test the structural integrity of everything from bridges to airplane wings. You can think of it as a digital crash test. A researcher creates a hyper-detailed 3D model of an object, breaks it down into millions of tiny virtual pieces, the finite elements, and then applies simulated forces to see exactly how it bends, twists, and breaks. Biomechanists realized they could use this same technique to put ancient jaws to the test in a way they never could with fragile, irreplaceable fossils. So they built digital jawbones. They created a meticulously accurate 3D model of a modern human jaw, complete with its prominent chin. Then, they did something a fossil hunter could only dream of. They digitally shaved the chin off, creating a second model that was identical in every way except for the lack of a mental eminence. They now had a direct one-to-one comparison, a jaw with a chin versus a jaw without one. They placed both virtual jaws into the computer and subjected them to the intense, complex forces of a human bite, precisely simulating the vertical bending and twisting that the chewing hypothesis claimed the chin was built to resist. The result was a stunning blow to the theory. The models revealed that the jaws with chins were actually no better at handling those particular types of stresses than the jaws without chins. The digital chin, the supposed buttress, barely made a difference. It was like discovering that the majestic flying buttresses on a cathedral were mostly for decoration and weren't actually holding the walls up. The very function the chin was supposedly designed for, it didn't seem to be performing with any real proficiency. This created a profound schism in the scientific community. On one hand, you had the elegant logic and perfect timing of the chewing hypothesis. On the other, you had the latest, most sophisticated experimental data saying it couldn't be right. The debate remains unresolved to this day. It is the perfect example of a scholarly standoff, where two sets of compelling evidence point in completely opposite directions. The most logical functional explanation for the chin had been critically wounded, leaving a vacuum at the heart of the mystery. And into that vacuum, a much stranger, more radical idea was about to emerge. After decades of searching, every functional hypothesis for the chin had either been debunked or seriously wounded. The mystery was deeper than ever. This is a common pattern in science. When you've exhausted all the obvious answers, it might be time to ask a completely different kind of question. After almost a century of asking, "What is the chin for?" some scientists began to wonder, what if it's for nothing at all? What if it's just there? As weird as that sounds, this wasn't a surrender. It was the introduction of one of the most powerful and controversial ideas in modern evolutionary biology, an idea that came not from a fossil dig, but from a trip to a cathedral in Venice. To understand it, you have to picture the Basilica of San Marco. You're standing inside, looking up at the magnificent mosaic domes. Now, look at the corners where the round base of a dome has to sit on top of 4 rounded arches that form a square. In that corner, between the tops of the arches and the base of the dome, a curved triangular space is inevitably created. Architects call this space a spandrel. For centuries, these spandrels in San Marco have been decorated with beautiful mosaics of angels and apostles, and if you didn't know anything about architecture, you might assume that the entire building was designed specifically to create these perfect triangular canvases for the artists. You might think the spandrels were the purpose of the design, but you'd be wrong. In a landmark 1979 paper, 2 evolutionary biologists, Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin, used this exact architectural feature to make a revolutionary point about evolution. The spandrel wasn't designed on purpose. It is the necessary, unavoidable, geometric byproduct of putting a dome on top of 4 arches. You can't do one without creating the other. It has no function of its own. It's just a consequence of the primary architectural choices. The artists simply came along later and took advantage of the space that was already there. Gould and Lewontin argued that biology is full of these spandrels. These are traits that were never directly shaped by natural selection for a specific job. They are simply the non-adaptive byproducts of other evolutionary changes happening elsewhere in the body. This was the radical question that some scientists began to ask about the chin. What if it's just an evolutionary spandrel? What if it's the biological equivalent of that triangular space in the cathedral? What if it has no function at all, and is just the inevitable result of other, much bigger architectural changes to the human skull? This is an incredibly difficult idea to grapple with, because our brains are wired to look for purpose and function in everything. It's a quirky tidbit of our own psychology that we assume everything has a reason. But evolution doesn't work like a human engineer, designing each part for a specific task. It's a messy, historical process, and sometimes it just leaves things behind. Of course, this hypothesis comes with a huge problem, a real burden of proof. How do you prove a negative? How can you demonstrate conclusively that something doesn't have a purpose? It's almost impossible. You can debunk one functional hypothesis after another, but there might always be one you haven't thought of yet. This is why the science of the chin stayed in limbo for so long. The functional explanations, like the chewing hypothesis, were testable. You could build a model and see if it worked. But the spandrel hypothesis was more of a philosophical stance, a default explanation you were left with when everything else failed. Proving that the chin was just an accident of evolution would require a completely new way of looking at the problem, one that focused not on its supposed function, but on the grand architectural story of the skull itself. The idea of a spandrel is beautiful and frustrating. It asks you to look at a prominent feature and accept that it might be an accident. But how would such an accident even happen? How do you build an entire face and end up with a spare part sticking out at the bottom? To understand the spandrel hypothesis, you have to synthesize that entire grand multi-million-year story we've been telling. It's not a story about chins. It's a story about heads, and the chin is just the final strange footnote. It all comes down to the simple fact that your lower jaw isn't one single thing. It's 2 different projects being built at the same time by 2 different construction crews, following 2 slightly different sets of blueprints. Let's imagine it. The first construction crew is in charge of the alveolar region. This is the upper part of your jaw, the bony ridge that your teeth are actually socketed into. This crew's job is directly tied to your dental needs. For millions of years, As our ancestors chewed on tough, uncooked food, the blueprints for this region demanded a big, robust structure to house a massive set of teeth. But then, as we've seen, everything changed. We tamed fire, we invented stone tools, and our diet softened dramatically. The evolutionary pressure for huge teeth vanished. So, the instructions for the alveolar construction crew were revised, year after year, millennium after millennium. The blueprint was downsized. The entire tooth-bearing region began to shrink and, crucially, to retreat backward as our whole face tucked itself under our expanding brain. Now, let's look at the second construction crew. They're in charge of the underlying foundation, the main structural beam of your jaw. This is what developmental biologists call the mandible proper, or the basal mandible. Its job is to provide the fundamental shape and strength of the jaw. And here's the key to the entire mystery. This crew is following a slightly different, more conservative set of blueprints. While the tooth-bearing part of the jaw was in a state of rapid retreat, the underlying structural bone didn't get the same urgent memo. It also shrank over evolutionary time, but not as fast and not as far back. This is the core piece of scientific evidence for the spandrel hypothesis. The observation of these two different growth fields, the alveolar and the basal, evolving at different rates. So you have this architectural mismatch. The top floor of the building, the toothy part, is being aggressively pulled back and downsized, while the ground floor, the structural jawbone, is staying relatively put. What is the inevitable geometric result? An overhang. The bottom part is left sticking out. And that overhang, that small ledge of bone left behind by the retreat of everything above it, is the chin. The spandrel hypothesis argues that the chin didn't grow outward with a purpose. It was left behind as an accident. It is the result of a developmental lag between two interconnected but separately evolving parts of your face. Scholars like the renowned anatomist Donald Enloe spent their careers mapping these complex facial growth patterns, showing how the interplay of different fields creates the final adult face. And while there is still debate about the precise genetic controls of this process, the general principle is widely accepted. It's a beautifully simple, non-functional explanation. It accounts for the timing. The chin only appears when our faces have completed their great retraction, and it explains why no other animal has one. No other animal has undergone our specific, peculiar sequence of brain expansion and dental reduction. It's a quirky thought that this defining feature of our species might just be a relic of an abandoned construction project, a ghost of a larger jaw we no longer needed. The chin isn't the point of the story. It's just the punctuation mark at the end of it. The spandrel hypothesis is elegant, logical, and maddeningly difficult to prove. How can you be sure the chin is just an accident? To find the final crucial piece of evidence, you need a control group, a natural experiment. You need to find another species that was incredibly similar to us, that also had a massive brain and faced immense evolutionary pressures, but that solved its architectural problems in a slightly different way. Luckily for us, evolution provided the perfect test case: the Neanderthals. Let's bring their skull back onto the museum table one last time. As you look at it, you are struck not by how primitive it looks, but by how profoundly different its design philosophy is from our own. You already know they were chinless, but now you see the reason why. While our Homo sapiens face is flat, with a vertical profile tucked under the forehead, the Neanderthal face does the exact opposite. Their entire mid-face, the region around the nose and mouth, is pulled dramatically forward. This is a condition known as mid-facial prognathism, Imagine their skull in profile, where your forehead is a sheer cliff dropping down to a relatively flat face. Theirs is more like a long, sloping hill. Their large brow ridge flows into a prominent, projecting nose, and their teeth are set well forward of their cheekbones. It's a completely different solution to the problem of fitting a face onto a large-brained head. So why did they have this strange, pulled-forward face? Paleoanthropologists have been debating this for decades, and there are two main competing ideas. The first, and more quirky, of the two is the teeth as a third hand hypothesis. When you examine Neanderthal incisors, their front teeth, you often find them worn down to stumps, covered in scratches and chips. The pattern of wear suggests they were habitually gripping things with their front teeth, perhaps using their mouths as a vice to hold animal hides steady while they scraped them with stone tools. This demanding, repetitive behavior would require an incredibly strong and robust front jaw, pulling the entire tooth row forward to create a powerful biomechanical grip. The second, more mainstream historical fact is the cold air adaptation hypothesis. Neanderthals evolved and lived through the brutal ice ages of Europe. The air they were breathing was not just cold, but incredibly dry. Inhaling that kind of air directly into your lungs can cause serious damage. The theory is that the Neanderthals' enormous projecting nasal cavity acted as a sophisticated radiator and humidifier. The large internal surface area would have warmed and moistened the frigid air with each breath, protecting their delicate lungs. To house this massive internal air conditioner, their whole midface had to be pulled forward. Whichever hypothesis you favor, and scholars still argue about which was the primary driver, the architectural result is the same. Because their entire facial structure was pulled forward to meet these other needs, they never experienced the crucial geometric event that happened in our lineage. They never had a situation where the upper, tooth-bearing part of the jaw retreated faster than the underlying basal bone. Their different evolutionary journey led to a different set of architectural byproducts. They didn't get a chin. Instead, they got that big, projecting nose and a hollow space behind their last molar called a retromolar gap. This is what makes the comparison so powerful. It's a perfect natural experiment. You have two closely related human species, both with big brains. One path, the sapiens path, involved facial retraction and dental reduction, and the non-functional byproduct was a chin. The other path, the Neanderthal path, involved mid-facial projection, and the non-functional byproducts were a huge nose and a gap behind the teeth. The chin isn't special. It's just our spandrel. It's the byproduct of our particular evolutionary story. Seeing the Neanderthal's chinless face isn't like looking at a failed attempt to be like us. It's like looking at a brilliant success story from an entirely different book. The story of the Neanderthal face, so profoundly different from our own, gives the spandrel hypothesis its powerful comparative punch. But it leaves you with an even deeper question. If our face and the Neanderthal face are two different solutions to an engineering problem, what's written in the instruction manual? You can study the final product, the fossils, the bones, all you want. You can run simulations on how that final product behaves under stress. But to find the ultimate origin of the design itself, you have to go to the blueprint. You have to look at the recipe. And that means leaving the world of dusty bones behind and entering the microscopic, digital world of the genome. This is the realm of a relatively new and incredibly exciting field of science called evolutionary developmental biology, or EVO-DEVO for short. It's a synthesis of two fields that used to be separate. Evolutionists studied the history of life through fossils, while developmental biologists studied how a single fertilized egg grows into a complex creature. Evo Devo puts them together, and its central idea is simple but profound. Big evolutionary changes are often the result of tiny tweaks to the genes that control development. You don't need to reinvent an entire animal from scratch. You just need to change the recipe a little, add a little more of this, a little less of that, bake for 10 minutes longer, and you can get a radically different cake. Your body, as it was forming in the womb, was following an ancient genetic recipe book. And this book has a set of master chef genes that control the whole process. These are the master control genes, the ones that lay out the entire body plan. The most famous of these are the HOX genes. This is a family of genes that were first discovered in fruit flies, in Nobel Prize-winning work that showed how they act like architects, assigning an identity to each segment of a developing embryo, telling it, "You will be the head, you will be the thorax, you will be the abdomen." A quirky tidbit is that the name HOX is short for homeobox, which refers to a specific 180 base pair sequence of DNA found within these genes. This sequence acts like a key, allowing the protein to bind to the DNA and turn other genes on or off in a precise sequence. It's the master switchboard of life. Our faces are no different. They are built by a mind-bogglingly complex network of these master control genes, like the PAX genes that are crucial for developing eyes and a nose. A tiny change in the timing or intensity of one of these genetic signals during embryonic development can have a huge cascade of effects on the final adult shape. A gene that tells a certain area to grow for a week instead of 6 days can be the difference between a flat face and a projecting one. And this is the new frontier in the chin mystery. Scientists are still mapping the incredibly complex genetic architecture of the face, but they now have the tools to compare the instruction manuals of different species directly. Thanks to the pioneering work of scientists like Svante Pääbo, who figured out how to extract and sequence ancient DNA from Neanderthal bones, we can now place our genome side by side with theirs, and with that of our closest living relative, the chimpanzee. We can literally scan through billions of letters of genetic code, looking for the specific differences in those genes that control craniofacial development. It's the ultimate evolutionary detective story, a search for a single typo or a rewritten sentence in our recipe book that might explain why our jaw develops on a path that leads to a chin, while a Neanderthal's takes a different route. The final answer to this centuries-old question may not come from a fossil dig or a computer model, but from a quiet, sterile sequencing lab. Hidden somewhere in the 3 billion letters of your DNA is the line of code that says, "Build a chin." And finding it might finally tell us whether that instruction was a deliberate command from natural selection or just an accidental smudge on the blueprint. To truly understand the case for the chewing hypothesis, you have to become a connoisseur of the bite. You have to appreciate the raw, brutal, and surprisingly elegant mechanics of what happens every time you grind a piece of food. The human jaw is a machine, a classic Class 3 lever system, where the force, from your muscles, is applied between the pivot point, your jaw joint, and the load, the food you're eating. It's the same system as a pair of tweezers or a fishing rod, built not for power, but for speed and fine control. But when it comes to your back teeth, your jaw can generate a shocking amount of force. So, let's focus on the engine room of your mouth, your molars. These are your grinders, the broad, multi-cusped platforms designed for the heavy-duty work of pulverizing food into a digestible paste. Molar chewing is where your jaw generates its absolute maximum force. and it's this specific action that biomechanists believe holds the key to the chin. To generate this force, your skull employs a team of 4 powerful muscles on each side. First, there's the heavyweight champion, the masseter. You can feel it right now. Place your fingers on your cheek, just below your cheekbone, and clench your teeth. That hard, bulging muscle is your masseter. It's a thick, rectangular slab of power that stretches from your cheekbone down to the outer angle of your jaw. Its only job is to clamp your jaw shut with incredible force. Working with it is the temporalis, a beautiful fan-shaped muscle that spreads across the side of your head. If you put your fingers on your temples and clench again, you can feel it contract. The temporalis not only pulls your jaw shut, but, because of its shape, its rear fibers can also pull the jaw backward, an action called retraction. Those are the big, obvious muscles. But the real artistry of the chew comes from 2 hidden muscles, the medial and lateral pterygoids. They're tucked away deep inside your face, stretching from the base of your skull to the inside of your jaw. They are the unsung heroes of mastication. They help close the jaw, but their most important job is to produce the subtle side-to-side grinding motion, what scientists call lateral excursion. When you chew on your right side, your left pterygoids contract to pull your jaw slightly to the right, dragging the lower molars across the upper ones like a pestle in a mortar. It's this complex, coordinated dance of 4 sets of muscles that produces the uniquely human rotary chewing motion. When this muscular symphony fires in concert, the force is immense. The average person can generate about 150 to 200 pounds of pressure per square inch, PS1, on their molars. Trained athletes or people who habitually clench their jaws can generate far more. For a bit of quirky context, that's more than enough force to crack most nuts, and it's in the same ballpark as the bite force of a German shepherd. This brings us to the crucial biomechanical consequences. When you bite down hard on your right molars, you create a wildly unbalanced set of forces. The right side of your jaw, the working side, is put under immense compression. But the left side, the balancing side, is now subject to a complex bending force. It wants to be pulled upwards and inwards, creating tension along its bottom edge. But the most critical stress, the one that is the absolute centerpiece of the chewing hypothesis, happens at the front. As all those muscles pull up and in on that short, wide tugboat of a human jaw, the wishbone effect goes into overdrive. The 2 halves of the jaw are being squeezed together at the top, near your incisors, and pulled apart at the bottom, right at the base of the symphysis. You can think of your jaw as a suspension bridge, with your 2 jaw joints as the towers. The chewing force is a heavy truck driving on one side of the bridge. This doesn't just stress the area under the truck. It sends a complex wave of tension and strain across the entire structure, and the point that experiences a unique pulling apart force is the very center of the span. Giovanni Alfonso Borelli, a 17th century physicist and a father of biomechanics, was among the first to apply mechanical principles to animal movement, though he could only dream of the tools we have now to visualize these stresses. Modern biomechanical models show this tension at the symphysis with beautiful, alarming clarity. And it is this very specific, localized problem, this constant threat of being pulled apart at the bottom, that the chewing hypothesis claims your chin was built to solve. It is, in this view, a perfect little strut of bone, a permanent buttress against the immense power of your own bite. The crushing power of your molars tells one side of the story of brute force and grinding efficiency. But your jaw is not a one-trick pony. It's a versatile toolkit. And to understand the full range of stresses it endures, you have to move from the engine room at the back to the delicate precision instruments at the front, your incisors. These are your cutting and tearing teeth. While your molars are broad platforms, your incisors are shaped like tiny, sharp spades, a feature scientists call spatulate incisors, which is unique to hominins and different from the more pointed, peg-like incisors of many other primates. Their job isn't to pulverize, but to initiate the process, to snip a piece of food from a larger hole, or to grip and tear. And when you shift the bite from your molars to your incisors, the entire mechanical landscape of your jaw changes. When you bite down on an apple with your front teeth, the symphony of muscle activation is completely different. The side-to-side grinding motion from the pterygoid muscles is gone. Instead, the action becomes a much more direct, vertical clamping force, primarily driven by the big masseter and temporalis muscles. This turns your jaw into a less efficient, but sometimes necessary lever. Think about using a pair of pliers. When you grip something close to the pivot, you have immense power. That's your molars. When you try to snip something with the very tip of the pliers, you have to squeeze much harder to get the same result. That's your incisors. Because the load, the apple, is now much farther from the pivot point, your jaw joint, your muscles have to work significantly harder to generate the same biting force. This inefficiency has serious consequences for the jaw itself. Firstly, it puts a tremendous amount of strain on your temporomandibular joint, TMJ. The joint is compressed with much greater force during an incisal bite, a fact that anyone with TMJ disorders can painfully attest to. But it also sends a different kind of stress wave through the bone of the jaw. Instead of the side-to-side twisting and the wishbone effect of molar chewing, biting at the front subjects the entire U-shape of the mandible to a powerful bending force. Imagine holding a wishbone and pushing the two arms together at the very tip. The entire structure wants to bow outwards. The same happens to your jaw. It experiences a bending moment that puts the outer surface under tension and the inner surface under compression. This brings us to a critical question in the chewing debate. The classic version of the hypothesis focuses on the vertical bending at the symphysis caused by molar chewing. But some researchers have argued that the chin is actually better positioned to resist the bending forces created by biting with the incisors. In this view, the chin acts less like a buttress against a pulling-apart force, and more like the flange on an I-beam, a structural reinforcement that prevents the entire beam from bending under a load. This has led to a fascinating and still ongoing scholarly debate. If the chin is indeed a biomechanical adaptation for chewing, which kind of chewing is it adapted for? Is it a specialist for molar grinding or incisal biting? This isn't just an abstract engineering problem, it has deep evolutionary roots. Remember the teeth as a third hand hypothesis we discussed with Neanderthals? Their massively worn front teeth are a testament to a life of heavy incisal use, gripping and pulling on things with their mouths. While our incisors aren't usually that worn, there's plenty of evidence that our ancestors also used their front teeth as tools. This suggests that incisal loading wasn't a rare event. It was a regular and mechanically demanding part of their daily lives. A quirky fact from biomechanics is that while molar bites are stronger overall, the incisors are capable of incredibly fine force modulation, allowing for delicate tasks like stripping a single seed from a stem. The chin, then, might be a response to the entire versatile range of behaviors our jaws evolved to perform. But the fact that scientists can't even agree on which chewing function the chin might be helping with is perhaps the biggest piece of evidence against the hypothesis altogether. If it were a truly efficient piece of engineering, its purpose would likely be a lot more obvious. For a significant period in the late 20th century, the chewing hypothesis wasn't just an idea, it was the idea. It was bolstered by a wave of biomechanical research that, for the first time, moved beyond simple observation and into the realm of predictive modeling. Now, you have to understand, these weren't the hyper-realistic, processor-melting digital simulations we have today. This was an earlier, more analog era of science. Think of it less like a modern CGI fest and more like a brilliant engineer applying classic time-tested principles of physics to a biological structure. It was a science of calipers, geometric diagrams, and the clever application of engineering theory to the architecture of bone. The models that came out of this period were built on a foundation of meticulous measurement and comparative anatomy. Researchers like Daniel Lieberman built upon earlier experimental work that had examined the precise stress patterns that different primate jaws experience when eating. They confirmed, with rigorous data, that the Homo sapiens jaw was a true outlier, uniquely short and uniquely broad. They then asked a simple question. According to the laws of physics, what should happen when you apply the forces of a human bite to this weirdly shaped structure? Their calculations, based on solid engineering principles, all pointed to the same critical weak point, the symphysis, that seam at the very front of the jaw. The models predicted that this area would be a hot spot for that dangerous, pulling apart force known as vertical bending. With a clear prediction in hand, they turned back to the bone itself, looking for the physical evidence of a solution. And they found what they believed to be the smoking gun. When they examined cross-sections of the human mandible, they discovered that the cortical bone, the dense, hard outer layer of the bone, was exceptionally thick right where their models predicted the stress would be highest, down at the base of the symphysis. This was a eureka moment. It was a perfect textbook illustration of Wolff's law in action. The bone, over countless generations, had apparently remodeled itself, piling on material exactly where it was needed to counteract the unique stresses of our bite. The chin, in this view, was no accident. It was the physical manifestation of this reinforcement, a purpose-built buttress. This evidence created a narrative that was almost impossible to resist. It had a clear cause and effect, it was supported by physical evidence, and it explained the timing of the chin's appearance with beautiful precision. The reason the chin doesn't appear until Homo sapiens, they argued, is because earlier species, from Australopithecus to Homo erectus, retained those more ape-like, longer jaw proportions. They didn't have the short, wide jaw that created the problem of vertical bending, so they never needed to evolve the solution. For a time, this seemed to settle the debate. The argument was so compelling, it won over a significant portion of the scientific community. The chin wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a clever piece of evolutionary engineering, a testament to the power of natural selection to solve a problem with elegant efficiency. A quirky tidbit from the history of science is how often a compelling, logical narrative can become the accepted truth, even before it's been subjected to every possible test. For many, the case of the chewing chin seemed open and shut. The models predicted a problem, and the bone seemed to show the solution. The story, it seemed, was finally over. The story seemed complete. The chewing hypothesis, supported by the elegant logic of biomechanics and the telltale thickness of the bone, reigned supreme for a time. But science is a restless enterprise, never satisfied with a story that's merely convenient. An explanation must survive not just the tests of its own time, but the more rigorous trials of the future. And for the Turing hypothesis, the future arrived in the form of a technology that its original proponents could have only dreamed of, a tool that would allow scientists to do the impossible, to crash test a human jaw without breaking a single precious fossil. This brings us to the world of high-performance computing and the engineering marvel of finite element analysis FEA. Now, that sounds intimidating, but the concept is surprisingly simple. It's a technique that was born in the aerospace and automotive industries in the 1950s and 60s, a historical fact rooted in the need to build safer planes and cars without having to physically smash hundreds of them into a wall. An engineer creates a perfect, hyper-detailed 3D computer model of a structure, say a car chassis. Then the software breaks that complex shape down into millions of tiny, simple, interconnected pieces, the finite elements. A quirky tidbit is that these models can be so complex that a single simulation can take a supercomputer days or even weeks to run. Once the structure is digitized, the engineer can apply any force they can imagine: the force of a head-on collision, the vibration from a jet engine, and the software that will calculate precisely how the stress is distributed through every single one of those millions of tiny elements. It's a virtual stress test, a digital laboratory where you can see the invisible forces of physics at play. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, biomechanists realized they could turn this powerful engineering tool on the ancient question of the chin. They began by creating the most meticulously accurate 3D models of human mandibles ever conceived, based on high-resolution CT scans of actual skulls. Every curve, every ridge, every variation in bone density was captured in the digital blueprint. Then they performed a kind of virtual surgery that was both brilliant and blasphemous. They digitally shaved the chin off. With a few clicks of a mouse, they created a second jaw model, a control jaw that was a perfect anatomical twin to the first in every single way, except it was chinless. It had the same short, broad proportions, the same muscle attachment points, the same everything. It was the perfect experiment, a direct one-to-one comparison that could finally isolate the true mechanical role of the chin itself. They placed both of these virtual jaws into the supercomputer. They programmed in the precise forces of the human chewing muscles, simulating the crushing power of the molars and the tearing action of the insurs. Then they hit run. The simulation began, and the computer painted a picture of the stress flowing through the bone, color-coding it from cool blue, low stress, to fiery red, high stress. They watched as the vertical bending forces, the famous wishbone effect, tried to pull the symphysis apart. The entire scientific community held its breath. If the Turing hypothesis was correct, the chinned jaw should have shown a cool, stable blue at its base, while the chinless jaw should have lit up bright red, a clear sign of structural weakness. The scientific evidence that came back was not just surprising, it was a bombshell. The chin made almost no difference. More recent biomechanical modeling reveals that jaws with chins actually aren't any better at handling those particular types of stresses than those without chins. The chinless model, the one that should have been mechanically inferior, handled the forces just as effectively. The supposed buttress, the elegant strut of bone that was the centerpiece of the entire theory, turned out to be almost mechanically irrelevant. This created a profound crisis. The most powerful, most sophisticated evidence, gathered from the cutting edge of technology, directly contradicted the neat, logical story that had been accepted for years. This left scientists in the midst of a fierce, scholarly debate, that continues to this day. Whom do you trust? The beautiful, intuitive logic of the earlier models, or the cold, hard, and deeply counterintuitive data from the new ones? The chewing hypothesis wasn't just wounded, it was on the ropes, and the mystery of the chin was suddenly, bewilderingly, wide open again. So where does this leave us? If you were watching this debate as a boxing match, the chewing hypothesis would be staggering. It has just taken a devastating blow from the champion of modern technology, finite element analysis. The ringside judges, represented by the scientific community, are in a state of shock. The challenger, the spandrel hypothesis, which argues the chin is just an accident, suddenly looks like a serious contender. But here's the fascinating thing about science. A good hypothesis, one that is built on a solid foundation of logic and evidence, rarely dies in a single clean knockout. It often becomes a kind of zombie, a theory that refuses to stay in the grave because parts of it are just too compelling to ignore. And so, today, we are in the strange position of re-evaluating a theory that has been, for all intents and purposes, experimentally falsified. Why doesn't everyone just abandon the chewing hypothesis? Because you can't just wish away the powerful evidence that supported it in the first place. You still have to account for the perfect timing. The chin appears in the fossil record at the exact moment our jaws achieve their unique, short, broad proportions. That is an almost impossibly perfect correlation to be a mere coincidence. And you still have to account for the thickened cortical bone. The fact that the densest part of the jawbone is located precisely where the older models predicted the most stress is a powerful piece of anatomical data. The FEA models may say the chin has no effect, but the bone itself seems to be telling a different story, like a witness whose testimony contradicts the video evidence. This has led to a fascinating and deeply technical scholarly debate that forces us to question not just the hypothesis, but the tools we use to test it. It pits one form of evidence against another. On one side, you have the elegant deductive logic of classic biomechanics. On the other, you have the raw, brute force processing power of supercomputers. The central question becomes, which one is right? This has led some researchers to take a step back and ask, are our digital models truly perfect? An FEA simulation is only as good as the information you feed it. Is it possible that we're not simulating the forces of chewing in quite the right way? Maybe the chin's real function isn't to resist one single massive bite, but to handle the cumulative effects of millions of smaller, repetitive chewing cycles over a lifetime, a kind of fatigue resistance that our current models aren't designed to detect. A quirky but illustrative way some researchers talk about this is to call the chin a failed hypothesis graveyard, a place where beautiful ideas, from speech to fighting to chewing, have gone to be buried by inconvenient facts. But perhaps the truth is more nuanced. It's possible that the chin isn't a primary adaptation, but a secondary one. This is a concept in evolution called exaptation, where a trait that evolved for one purpose, or no purpose at all, like a spandrel, gets co-opted for a new job. Maybe the chin really is just an accidental byproduct of our shrinking faces, a true spandrel. But once it was there, maybe it did provide a very slight, almost imperceptible, structural advantage, which natural selection then subtly favored. In this view, it's both an accident and a functional feature, just not in the dramatic, purpose-built way we first imagined. This is a perfect example of the scientific method at its messy, brilliant best. A hypothesis is proposed, it's tested, and the tests produce contradictory results. This doesn't mean the science has failed. It means the problem is more interesting than we thought. Today, the chewing hypothesis is no longer the reigning champion. It has been demoted. It lives on, not as a proven fact, but as a persistent and tantalizing possibility. A zombie that haunts the debate, reminding us that the story of our bones is written in a language that we are still struggling to fully understand. The repeated failure of one functional hypothesis after another leaves you in a profound state of intellectual limbo. When you've tried every key on the ring and none of them will open the door, you have to entertain the possibility that you're standing in front of the wrong door. You have to be willing to ask a question so fundamental it feels like cheating. What if there is no key because there is no lock? This is the very essence of the spandrel hypothesis, an idea that wasn't just a new explanation for the chin, but a revolutionary challenge to the way many scientists thought about evolution itself. To understand it, we have to leave the anatomy lab and take a trip, not just in time, but in discipline, to the intersection of architecture, art history, and evolutionary theory. Our guides on this journey are two of the most brilliant and rebellious minds of 20th century biology, Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin. In 1979, they published a paper with a famously long and formidable title, The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm, a critique of the adaptationist program. That title is a mouthful, but it was a declaration of intellectual war. They were taking aim at what they saw as a lazy habit of thought in their own field, the assumption that every single trait of an organism, from the stripe on a zebra to the length of a giraffe's neck, must be a perfect adaptation, a finely tuned solution to some environmental problem. They gave this way of thinking a wonderfully quirky name, the Panglossian Paradigm. This was a reference to Dr. Pangloss, a character in Voltaire's satirical novel Candide. Dr. Pangloss is a hopelessly optimistic philosopher who believes that all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds, arguing, for example, that our noses were clearly designed to hold up spectacles. Gould and Lewontin were accusing their colleagues of being Dr. Panglosses, of telling just-so stories that assumed every biological feature was a perfect design, rather than considering that it might just be there. Their central argument, their evidence for this new way of thinking, came from the magnificent Basilica of San Marco in Venice. Imagine you're standing beneath its soaring golden domes. Your eyes are drawn to the corners where the round dome meets the square created by 4 massive arches. In these corners, a specific geometric shape is unavoidably created, a curved, tapering triangle. This is an architectural spandrel. In San Marco, these spandrels are decorated with breathtaking mosaics of the 4 evangelists. And if you were to look at them without understanding architecture, you might make a Panglossian assumption that the entire building was meticulously designed to create these 4 perfect triangular canvases for the artists. You might think the spandrels were the purpose, but as Gould and Lewontin pointed out, this gets the story completely backward. The spandrels have no primary function. They are the inevitable, non-negotiable byproduct of a fundamental architectural choice, placing a round dome on square arches. You cannot do one without creating the other. They are a consequence, not a cause. The artists simply came along afterward and cleverly utilized the space that was already there. This is the heart of the biological argument. A spandrel is a feature that arises not because it was selected for, but as a necessary side effect of other evolutionary changes that were selected for. Evolution, they argued, is not an all-powerful architect that can design any part it wants. It is constrained by the laws of physics, by developmental genetics, and by the body plan it has to work with. These are architectural constraints, and sometimes they leave behind non-functional leftover spaces. This was a paradigm-shifting idea. It proposed that the default assumption in biology should not be adaptation, but neutrality. Evolutionary biologists still debate the frequency and importance of spandrels versus true adaptations in the grand tapestry of life, but the paper forced everyone to consider a new possibility. And the human chin became the poster child for this very idea. After a century of failed attempts to find its function, maybe the chin is our most famous biological spandrel. Maybe it's not for speaking, fighting, or chewing. Maybe it is just the inevitable, beautiful, and utterly non-functional geometric consequence of building a Homo sapiens head. It is our spandrel of San Marco, a defining feature that tells us less about our purpose and more about our peculiar history. So the chin might just be a beautiful accident, a non-functional piece of architectural flair left over from the grand remodeling project of the human head. It's a compelling idea, but it feels abstract. To really believe it, you have to be able to see it happen. You have to visualize the geometry, to watch the slow, multi-million-year-long process of facial reduction as if it were a time-lapse video. So let's do exactly that. Let's become the architects of the human face and watch, step by step, how this strange little ledge gets built, not by addition, but by subtraction. First, let's lay the foundation. You have to start with the ancestral blueprint, the skull of an early hominin like Australopithecus afarensis. Put it in your mind's eye. The most striking feature is its prognathism. The entire lower face, the snout, juts forward aggressively. The brain case behind it is small and low. Now, look closely at the lower jaw in profile. The teeth, which are huge by our standards, are the most forward-projecting part. Below them, the jawbone simply slopes backward and away. There is no hint of a chin. This was the standard, successful design for millions of years. This is our starting point. Now, the remodeling begins. Two immense forces are about to be applied to this structure. From behind, the brain case begins its slow, relentless expansion, inflating like a balloon. From the front, thanks to a softer diet of cooked food and processed meat, the teeth and the bone that holds them, the alveolar process, begin to shrink. The entire dental arcade is becoming smaller and less robust. The key to the whole spandrel argument is that these two forces result in the entire face being pulled back or retracted underneath the ballooning frontal lobe. Scholars still argue passionately about which was the primary driver in this process. Was it the push from the expanding brain being the dominant force, or was it the pull from a shrinking dental apparatus that led the way? In all likelihood, it was a complex feedback loop between the two. But here is the crucial piece of the puzzle, the subtle detail on which the entire geometry hinges. As the face retreats, it does not move as a single solid block. Remember, your jaw is two different construction projects in one. You have the upper, tooth-bearing alveolar region, and you have the lower structural basal mandible. The scientific evidence from decades of studying craniofacial development shows that these two regions retreated at different rates. The alveolar part, being directly tied to the shrinking teeth, pulled back dramatically. The basal bone at the bottom, however, was more conservative. It also retreated, but not nearly as far or as fast. Let's use a simple analogy. Imagine a two-story building sitting right on the edge of a slowly eroding cliff. For safety, you decide to move the entire building back. But the top floor is a lightweight, prefabricated structure, while the ground floor is a heavy, deep-set stone foundation. It's much easier to move the top floor than the bottom one, so you manage to drag the top story back 20 feet from the cliff edge. But you only succeed in moving the massive foundation back 15 feet. What's the result? The foundation, the ground floor, now juts out 5 feet in front of the top story. It has created a ledge, an overhang, not because you added anything, but because you subtracted the two parts unevenly. That overhang is your chin. It is the geometric ghost of a jaw that used to be aligned with a much larger set of teeth. This also plays into a wonderfully quirky idea in biology called neoteny, the retention of juvenile features into adulthood. If you look at a baby chimpanzee, it has a relatively flat face and a big, dome-like head compared to its body. As it grows up, its jaw and snout grow forward dramatically. In a sense, humans are the apes who never made that final step. We retain the childlike facial proportions of our primate cousins our entire lives. Our flat face is a neotenous trait, and the chin is simply the strange geometric consequence of freezing our facial development in this early stage. It wasn't a structure that was actively built. It was a structure that was revealed when the scaffolding of our ancestral jaw was taken away. The image of a cliff eroding unevenly is a powerful one. It gives you a clear, intuitive picture of how the chin could be an accidental overhang. But your face is not a cliff. It wasn't passively worn away by the forces of nature. It was actively, meticulously built, cell by cell, following a precise billion-year-old instruction manual written in the language of DNA. To truly understand the spandrel hypothesis, you have to move beyond the simple geometry and into the astonishingly complex world of developmental biology. You have to see your chin not as a leftover, but as the final result of a subtle shift in the timing of a very ancient construction project. The first thing you have to understand is that your jaw is not a single unified object. It looks like one solid bone, but from a developmental perspective, it's more like a collection of different neighborhoods or modules that have been seamlessly merged together. Each of these modules has its own growth pattern, its own schedule, and is controlled by its own distinct set of genetic switches. This is the quirky and beautiful reality of how bodies are built, not from a single top-down blueprint, but as a mosaic of semi-independent parts that have to coordinate with each other. The alveolar process, that tooth-bearing ridge, is one such module. The basal mandible, the underlying structural beam, is another. They are neighbors, but they follow different local ordinances. For much of the 20th century, the master cartographer of these facial neighborhoods was a brilliant anatomist named Donald Enloe. This is a mainstream historical fact that is foundational to modern orthodontics and facial surgery. Enloe spent his career painstakingly mapping how the bones of the face grow, not by simply getting bigger like an inflating balloon, but through a complex dance of addition and subtraction called remodeling. He showed, for example, that many facial bones grow according to a V principle, where bone is added to the inner surface of a V shape and simultaneously resorbed from the outer surface. The result is that the V grows and moves through space. His work revealed the face as a dynamic, flowing landscape, not a static sculpture. This brings us to one of the most powerful concepts in all of Evo Devo: heterochrony. It's a fancy word, but it describes a very simple idea. Evolution often works by messing with the clock. Heterochrony is any change in the rate or timing of developmental processes. Imagine you have a genetic recipe that says, let the jaw grow for 10 years. A simple mutation might change that instruction to, let the jaw grow for 8 years. That tiny change in timing can result in a dramatically different adult animal. This is how you get things like salamanders that retain their juvenile gills into adulthood, or how humans ended up with brains that keep growing for far longer than a chimpanzee's. It's not about inventing new genes, it's about changing the schedule of the old ones. The spandrel hypothesis is, at its core, an argument about heterochrony. The scientific evidence comes from mapping the growth of the human face from infancy to adulthood. When you do this, you can literally watch the two modules of the jaw go their separate ways. The alveolar process, the tooth-bearing part, grows for a while and then slows down and begins a process of remodeling that effectively pulls it backward relative to the rest of the face. The basal bone at the bottom, however, continues on a more robust, forward and downward growth trajectory, a process that gets a final kick during the adolescent growth spurt. This differential timing, this developmental desynchronization, is the engine that creates the chin. The precise genetic and hormonal signals that orchestrate this temporal mismatch are still a subject of intense scholarly debate, but the pattern itself is undeniable. The chin, in this light, is a feature built not in space, but in time. It is the visible, physical echo of a moment in our evolutionary history when the developmental clock for the top of our jaw was set to run a little slower than the clock for the bottom. It is the result of a subtle falling out of sync between two neighboring parts of a complex machine. It is perhaps the most profound accident in the human body. So here you are, at the end of a long and winding road, and the most compelling answer to our mystery seems to be an accident. A glitch in the developmental timing, a geometric inevitability. After all the grand theories, the poetic, the primal, the practical, it feels like a strangely quiet and anticlimactic conclusion. And this is where you have to make a final, crucial shift in your thinking. You have to stop seeing the spandrel hypothesis as just another story competing for the prize. Instead, you have to see it for what it is in the cold, hard world of science. The default answer. It is the null hypothesis. In any scientific investigation, the null hypothesis is the baseline assumption, the position of no effect. It's the idea that there is no relationship between the two things you're studying. For example, if you're testing a new drug, the null hypothesis is that the drug does nothing. The entire purpose of your experiment is to gather enough strong, positive evidence to reject the null. And if you can't, if your results are ambiguous or inconclusive, you are scientifically obligated to accept the null hypothesis as the most likely truth. The burden of proof is never on the null. It's on the claim. Now apply this to the chin. The null hypothesis is that the chin has no function and is not an adaptation. It's just a feature. Every other idea we've explored, the speech hypothesis, the punching hypothesis, the chewing hypothesis, is an attempt to reject that null. Each one is a claim that says, no, this feature does have a purpose, and here is my evidence. But as we've seen, every single one of these attempts has failed to meet the burden of proof. The speech hypothesis was debunked by basic anatomy. The punching hypothesis crumbled under logical scrutiny. And the chewing hypothesis, the strongest challenger of them all, was critically wounded by our most advanced computer models. Since no one has successfully managed to prove a function, science, by its own rigorous rules, must fall back to the default position. The chin is non-adaptive. It is, by definition, a spandrel until proven otherwise. This is where another powerful tool of scientific reasoning comes into play. Occam's razor. This is a principle attributed to a 14th century English Franciscan friar and philosopher named William of Ockham. It states that when you are faced with multiple competing explanations for the same phenomenon, the simplest one is most likely to be correct. Now, simple doesn't mean dumber. It means the explanation that requires the fewest new assumptions. Let's compare the two narratives for the chin. The functional narrative requires a whole chain of special assumptions. A unique stress appeared in our jaws that no other animal had. Then random genetic mutations just happened to arise that created a chin. Then natural selection precisely favored this new structure because it was a good solution, even though our best evidence shows it isn't a very good solution. The spandrel narrative, on the other hand, requires only one assumption, and it's one we already know is true. Our faces underwent a massive architectura. This is the very essence of the critique that Gould and Lewontin were making with their idea of the Panglossian paradigm. They argued that a bias toward seeing adaptation everywhere, a cognitive habit they called adaptationism, was a kind of scientific disease, a tendency to invent complex, unsubstantiated stories when a simpler, structural explanation was sitting right there. Philosophers of science still debate the degree to which this bias affects research, but in the case of the chin, it seems like a perfect diagnosis. The conclusion is humbling. It's a less satisfying story. We want our bodies to be masterpieces of engineering, perfect machines where every part has a noble purpose. The spandrel hypothesis tells us that we are something far more interesting. We are messy, historical artifacts, walking museums of our own past, full of quirks, leftovers, and beautiful, pointless accidents. So the chin is an accident. A leftover. A spandrel. Science, in its cold, methodical way, seems to have settled on the most humbling explanation of all. But this is where the story takes a fascinating and uniquely human turn. Because we are a species that cannot leave a blank space alone. The moment evolution finished its messy, unintentional work, another, much faster kind of evolution kicked in. Cultural evolution. We took this functionless little ledge of bone, this anatomical footnote, and we turned it into a powerful symbol. We loaded it with meaning, with prejudice, with aspiration. We stopped asking what the chin is and started deciding what it means. This is a very old habit. For centuries, people have been captivated by the pseudoscience of physiognomy, the belief that you can accurately judge a person's character from their outward appearance. This idea was hugely popular in the 18th and 19th centuries, a historical fact made famous by the writings of a Swiss pastor named Johann Caspar Lavater. His books, filled with detailed illustrations, were bestsellers across Europe, proposing a science of face reading. And in this so-called science, the chin was a billboard for a person's inner resolve. A broad, well-defined chin, he argued, was the unmistakable mark of a firm, energetic, and courageous character. A weak, receding chin, by contrast, was a sign of cowardice, feebleness, and moral frailty. It was, of course, complete nonsense, a system of codified prejudice, but it tapped into a deep and persistent intuition. You don't have to read a 19th century book to see this idea in action. You see it every time you turn on a movie or open a comic book. Look at the face of a classic hero. Think of Superman. What's one of his most defining features? A square, powerful, heroic jawline, punctuated by a strong chin. Now picture a classic cartoon villain, the sniveling, cowardly sidekick. They are almost universally drawn with a weak, receding, or pointedly small chin. This is a visual shorthand, a piece of artistic code so deeply embedded in our culture that we don't even have to think about it. The quirky tidbit here is that character designers in animation studios have literal guidebooks, model sheets, that codify these tropes, ensuring that a hero's jaw is always drawn with a certain resolute angle. We have culturally programmed ourselves to associate a specific bone shape with abstract concepts like courage and cowardice. This obsession has followed us right into the 21st century, moving from the drawing board to the operating table. The scientific evidence for this is stark and can be found in the annual reports of plastic surgery societies. Procedures like genioplasty, chin augmentation, and the injection of dermal fillers to sculpt the jawline are among the fastest-growing cosmetic treatments in the world. Thousands of people every year pay to have the shape of this supposedly functionless bone altered to better fit our cultural ideals of beauty and strength, men often seeking a broader, more squared-off look, and women a more defined but tapered V shape. We are so invested in the symbolic meaning of the chin that we are now using technology to guide its evolution in real time, sculpting it to match the stories we tell ourselves about it. This, of course, opens up its own fascinating scholarly debate. Are these beauty standards purely arbitrary cultural inventions, or are they a faint, cultural echo of the very sexual selection hypothesis that we dismissed earlier? When we find a strong chin attractive, are we just conforming to a trend we saw in a magazine? Or are we responding to a deeply ancient, hardwired instinct that associates that shape with health, testosterone, and good genes? Sociologists and evolutionary psychologists are still fiercely arguing about where culture ends and biology begins. But what is clear is that we have taken a feature that biology tells us is probably an accident, and we have made it one of the most psychologically significant landscapes on the human face. And so, we end where we began. We are back in the 18th century, standing beside Carl Linnaeus as he writes two simple words next to the name of our species. Nosce te ipsum. Know thyself. It was a command, a challenge, a scientific mission statement. And for nearly 300 years, we have tried to answer it, to fill in that blank space in his great catalogue of life. We have journeyed deep into our own past, sifted through the dust of ancient riverbeds, and peered into the code of our own cells, all in the quest for a definitive answer. And the story of the chin, this strange and lonely little feature, has turned out to be a perfect parable for that larger quest. It is a story that has taught us less about the chin itself and more about the nature of science and the humbling reality of our own origins. What the chin teaches us, more than anything, is a lesson in scientific humility. We are a species that has split the atom and mapped the stars. We have deciphered the language of the genome and walked on the surface of another world. We are, by any measure, a creature of astonishing intellectual power. And yet, we cannot say with any certainty why we have the face that we see in the mirror every single day. We have followed every clue, tested every hypothesis with our most brilliant tools, and the mystery has only deepened. Every time we thought we had the answer, the universe seemed to offer a quiet, gentle correction, reminding us that our desire for neat, purposeful stories is often at odds with the messy, contingent reality of evolution. The chin stands as a permanent monument to the limits of our knowledge, a quiet rebuke to our arrogance. But there is a beautiful irony here. The one thing that all scientists can agree on is that even if the chin is functionally useless, it is still incredibly useful to us. It has become the accidental signature of our species. When a paleoanthropologist is carefully excavating a fragmentary jumble of hominin bones from 1,000,000 years of sediment, the discovery of a mandible is a moment of high drama. And if that mandible has the telltale inverted T of a mental eminence, it is a moment of pure clarity. It is an unambiguous signal. It says, Homo sapiens was here. That small, non-functional ledge of bone has become a diagnostic feature, a clear and reliable marker in the fossil record that allows us to identify our own kind, to trace the journey of our ancestors across the globe. It is the biological equivalent of a fingerprint left at the scene of history. It is, perhaps, the perfect ending to the story. We set out to find a grand purpose, a reason for being, for this unique piece of ourselves. And what we found was something far more profound.